Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author, bringing you a series of interviews with some amazing sculptors who inspire me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs accompanying the interview, the episode show notes, and get a free novel from sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello Sculpture Vultures, and thank you for joining me today. I'm afraid it's going to be a very short intro for me. I am afraid that this week I have been dealt a particularly challenging blow to our family, and I'm afraid that the event has robbed me entirely, even of my appetite to discuss my favourite subject, which is sculpture. But fortunately, I have pre-recorded this episode, and you're going to be having more than enough of me yakking on. Today I'm going to be discussing protective coatings for bronze, because this is the million-dollar question. I don't think there's ever a sculptor that I meet that doesn't ask me about them, and they've always got hope in their eyes that I'm going to know like the one truth. And of course, my heart's broken every time, because like everyone else, I am also waiting for the messiah of the protective coatings world to come along. I can promise you that it's not for the want of trying that I haven't found the one. I'm the kind of person that likes to read really boring reports on random research, and I like to sift through journals called Polymers Today. And my dentist absolutely hates me because all I do is pepper my visits with, well, what's that you're using? And just as an aside, quite worryingly, although my dentist is a very seasoned professional, he usually has no idea of what he's using to mould something on my tooth or glue it in or coat it with something. But they do have some very fine polymers that they use. So it's always quite an interesting day out when I go to the dentist. But generally speaking, in this department, tradition doesn't steer you too far wrong. Finishing a bronze in a traditional way that every foundry will usually advise, wax coating, it sounds rather dull, but the truth is that your protective coating has to be selected not because it has a zhuzhy, exciting name, or because it has just been the latest thing released. It needs to be decided on 3 individual factors. 1, its aesthetic presentation. So, by how it looks and what you think of it, what the surface looks like when it's on. 2, where's the statue going to be situated? And finally, how frequently that statue can be maintained. That means you have to be fairly familiar with a range of protective coatings and select the best one based on the points that I've just given above. So let's start off with wax, which everybody's heard of, and there's a reason it's stuck around for so long, and that's because it just looks so magnificent on bronze. It provides just the right level of luster, bringing out the subtleties of the shades of the patinated finish and the depth in the bronze, and to my mind, there's nothing quite like the way it warms up the surface. But, and this is one of those big buts, it perishes and breaks down relatively quickly, and it needs to be kept really clean and robust, which translates into meaning that you need to maintain your object regularly, frequently, if it has a protective coating of wax. Because wax is not a complete seal, and what I mean by this is that within the wax lattice there's lots of holes. If you think of a fishing net, that's why the moisture can still penetrate the surface, and the bronze will continue to change even with wax on it. But it does change more slowly. It is present, and it does reduce the amount of moisture, the amount of pollutants that are in contact directly with the metal. The research on the lifespan of wax is that it can last up to about a year, but the problem with research is it's done in a laboratory, and what you've got to remember is that bronze, being a 3D object and outdoors, you get the wind and rain hitting it from all directions. And so you'll find that one area will break down far, far faster than another. And also, the research doesn't really account for those external factors which accelerate the breakdown, like birds doing target practice on your statue as they sail overhead and landing great big dollops of, what should we call it, guano over the surface, or people constantly attracted to your statue and so stroking its surface and essentially rubbing away the wax. So what you have to think about is where your statue is located. So low level bronze, you would have to be protecting the statue much more regularly, perhaps monthly, because it's in such direct contact with so many different issues. Just to remember that once that coating breaks down, your bronze is free to react with the air and moisture and anything else. And because it's the nature of bronze to change, you really are in a position where it needs to be intact. Now, what you're probably thinking is, well, I don't care how nice it looks knowing that. Don't want my statue to have to be, maintained monthly. They don't always have to be maintained monthly. But what I mean is, despite how nice it looks, you might be thinking, I want something tough. I want something fearsome. And so everyone turns to lacquers very naturally. Now, lacquer, quite rightly, is much tougher, but it still has issues, don't we all? So let's start with aesthetics. Personally, I don't think that lacquer presents as nicely as wax. Now, I'm sure there will be some people who argue that, but for me, you tend to get the sheet of glass variety, and you can add matting agents, you can footer around and make sure that they have different balances. But my experience is that you tend to get the very shiny or the very matte. And I don't know, I haven't seen much in the middle that is convincing. Now, this means it comes down to a matter of taste. And also, that means that you go on to the next factor in my little shortlist that I gave you, which is location. Does it really matter if it's very, very shiny, if it's miles up in the air, at the top of a tower, on a building, or say on a column? We use lacquer for a project that you'll all know, which is the conservation of the acanthus leaves at the top of Nelson's column. So if you take a look at the column, you've obviously got good old Nelson stood up there with his beautiful bronze sword, but below his feet are the most beautiful ornate acanthus leaves in bronze. Now, from the ground, you cannot tell they're lacquered because it's miles away, and obviously a lacquer is more robust than wax, and therefore that is a very valid reason to use it. Now, the big issue with lower level bronze and lacquer is that it scratches like the devil, and once it does start scratching, it really does look tatty very quickly, and it starts to break down very quickly actually around the zone that has already been attacked. You start getting just lots of change, and also something about people tend to be attracted to things that flake, and they start scratching at it, and suddenly your bronze is getting more attention, again for the wrong reasons. So surely you're thinking there has to be something more heavyweight than the kind of lacquers that I'm talking about here. Now, heavyweight like Mike Tyson, except that that really shows my age. So maybe Anthony Joshua, that kind of strength. Well, usually for those kinds of coatings, you need a stove. What they tend to need is heat to make them cure that hard. Now, first off, you try finding a massive oven that can accommodate a, double life-size statue. Obviously, when they cast a sculpture, it's not cast in one piece like that. And so if you do find a oven that big, please tell me. Be very useful to know about. But generally speaking, it's not an easy thing to find. And also, you have to think forward about what might happen to your object in the future. if that coating does get damaged or scratched, believe me, if someone chucks a gallon of paint stripper over that statue, it will damage that coating. Or it doesn't have to even be paint stripper. If somebody graffitis a statue, lots of statues are quite controversial, even the ones that you wouldn't think are controversial can be. We've worked on one for years and years who keeps having his hand smashed, and you think, why exactly? But clearly it's something that draws a certain type of person to do that kind of damage. And you look at it, and something like graffiti and the kind of solvents that you find in spray paint will undermine a lacquer coating, even if it has been stove lacquered. May not completely strip it, but it will make it haze, it will make it look odd. You will see that even if you've taken off the graffiti, you'll see that underlying coating isn't what it once was. So you have to then, someone like me, has to then try and get that lacquer off. But now it's not in a foundry where it might have been lacquered, it's in situ. And let me tell you, you're going to need a vat of really hideous solvent. And we're all trying not to use so many solvents these days. And if we are using solvents, we're trying to use them sparingly, or trying to use the ones with the least impact on our own health and safety and on the world. And frankly, if you're using a really, really hard coating, you're just not going to be able to do that. Second of all, you just try and re-lacquer in a public space. Think about car plants. Have you ever seen them when they do these documentary programs, and basically they spray in the most perfectly dust-free, air-extracted booths? And there's a reason for that, which is contamination. Now, spraying outdoors, it's a nightmare. I'm not saying it can't be done. I've had to do it. Many people do, but it is not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. And there's just things that you just can't predict that crop up. Weather, obviously, is a factor. I mean, it changes continuously. Even with the best forecast, the minute before it can actually shower when it's supposed to be sunny. And you get changes in humidity, but you also get a big gust of air with a load of pollen and dust and grime and God knows what. And it sticks to your statue. It sticks to your tacky lacquer as it's curing. Now, you might think, well, so what? But if that lattice is interrupted with contaminants that are fixed adjacent to the surface, the coating is weakened. So it won't last the way it's supposed to do, and not for anywhere near the amount of years that it was supposed to do. And also remember that something has been pressed against your bronze, your very reactive surface, which is a contaminant, which is not ideal, because what's going to happen? That contaminant is going to react with your bronze, and if you get a freckle of corrosion, that is a weak point, and it's going to work its way out from there. And just think about what it's like to re-lacquer in a public space. Solvents waft around. There's really very little you can do about that. People panic. Really panic, and they complain, and there is health and safety issues involved in it, so it's really not ideal. And you have to assume in public spaces that objects, bronzes particularly, will get damaged, because they nearly always do. So I'm not saying there's no place for lacquers. There is, and we use them. But you have to go through those considerations that I discussed at the beginning: aesthetics, location, and maintenance frequency. In the case of Nelson's column, those areas on the top of that huge column will only have a possible maintenance project about every 20 years. And in that instance, wax isn't going to cut it. It's never going to hold up anywhere near that kind of duration. And so lacquer has to be considered. But even then, not all lacquers are made equal. So on to nano coatings, which is just, everyone loves a nano coating at the moment. It's my top question. But although the word nano is so fantastic and sounds really brilliant, I'm afraid that what you need to remember is that this is still a really emerging field, and I think it's going to be super exciting in the future. In the not too distant future, I'll say even. But where we are right now, and in terms of sculpture that is outdoors, it's a bit underwhelming. The hype doesn't quite stand up to the reality. My experience is that it performs okay, and that's about all I can say. It's nothing special. And I've also read the various research papers that have done quite extensive comparisons and testing, and their conclusions were about the same. It wasn't that much better than anything else we have. It certainly wasn't any better than a lacquer. Obviously, I'm talking specifically about your outdoor large objects. Internally, it can perform very, very well. With nano coatings, there are lots of different types of coating, all under the heading nano. I mean, actually, nano just means small, so it's a real kind of catch-all phrase. But within the category, you can include glass coatings, silicon dioxide. These can be affected quite badly by acids and alkalis, which is a pain, because obviously things like gritting the pavements and things like that means that you get quite a lot of chlorides, which can form hydrochloric acid, which affects the coating. And the other type that are common in this category are ceramic coatings. Now, these are actually way more resistant than anything else that I've come across. I mean, they're really, really hard, but in the same category, they are really, really hard. They're not impregnable, but when they actually fail, you literally have to grind the coating off. And I mean grind it off properly, which is not ideal if you're in the conservation field or if you're a sculptor that wants to have your original finish preserved. I mean, think of the damage that you're doing to a surface if you have to remove it that way. You also have to think similarly as with nano coatings as you did with lacquers about reapplication. If that was something that was removed and had to be reapplied, or someone decided to actually apply it once the object had been there, you've got the same issues with contamination. It doesn't do well when applied in a dirty environment, which frankly urban spaces really are. Now, it's worth considering this notion about how frequently bronze can be maintained, because it's a funny one. No one wants to pay for maintenance. I mean, I get it. It annoys me when I've cut back my wisteria one week and try and sit outside in the garden the next week and it's all over me again. I mean, it's a pain. But what I mean when I'm talking about how frequently it can be maintained, mostly I'm talking about theoretically. How easy is it to maintain that object in the zone that it's been placed? So if you think about what we were talking about before, objects that are really high up, they might need a hugely expensive scaffold to do the maintenance. I know that there's cherry pickers and things like that, but obviously if you're talking about dealing with a maintenance that might be days and days, it becomes quite difficult to work with a complicated treatment up high in a cherry picker. And they're still expensive as well, obviously. Then you've got in the middle of something, you might have something like in the middle of a fountain, which needs hundreds of litres of water, say, draining each time you have to access the statue. And that's annoying, bad for the environment, but also complex. So you might think, oh, it's really obvious that lacquer would be the answer because you don't want to do that very often. Well, anyone that owns a house knows how water can get absolutely anywhere into anywhere. So you tend to end up with things like lacquer failure because moisture's got underneath the coating. What happens is it tends to be inside the casting, and then when it gets a really hot day, it tends to evaporate out through the pores of the metal and then makes the lacquer fail from underneath its actual coating. But also you have a situation with things like water with limescale, and that's a really big problem because limescale, it doesn't react with the surface in the way that, say, a corrosion product forms on a surface, but it has these little hooks and it sits onto the surface and it really claws its way in. It's really hard. So in order to remove limescale from bronze, generally you are having to use abrasion, or you're having to either that, or you can use things like acidic gels very carefully. But the difference is that with a lacquer coating, acids and alkalis will affect it and abrasion will scratch right through it. So again, you're in a pickle, because now you might be thinking about, well, what about a statue that's just really easy? It's in the middle of a forecourt of a station. It's low level. That's not a problem. Well, the thing is that the kind of coating that you're thinking about in that instance, because you're going to have a mass of people in a station forecourt nearly all day and most of the evening too. So then you want to be thinking about something like a wax as a maintenance protective coating, because you need to get in and get out with the minimal number of health and safety issues and concerns as possible. So it's a very swift method, wax treatment. You have to clean the statue first, of course, but in comparison to a lacquer or nano coating, it really is rapid, and it means that the object could be maintained more frequently, but its longevity is obviously not quite in the same realm as the other coatings, but it has advantages. Another option would be something like a monument on a medium-sized plinth, maybe below a tree, and that could be lacquered, of course, but you'll get an awful lot of debris falling on your coating and rotting. Organic matter obviously rots down and it will compromise that coating once it sits there intact for a long time. And if at some point, again down the line, you have to maintain that statue and you find that actually there's an awful lot of activity happening where there's been damage to that coating, you may have to remove that lacquer and reapply. Again, what I said about applying lacquer in situ, you try to apply lacquer underneath a tree. Believe me, every bit of tree debris will fall on it and damage your finish, which kind of undermines it. So again, probably the best action in that case is to have a more frequent, say annual, protective coating regime, which is wax-based. I'd say, roughly, about 90% of the treatments we do are wax-based and say 10% are lacquered. We hardly ever use nano coatings at the moment. Now, I know what your next question is, which is, well, what do you recommend? What is the best coatings that we can buy? What is the use? Now, obviously, everyone has their own favourites. I'm going to just give you a few tips about in general terms before making a couple of recommendations. As a rule, I wouldn't recommend natural waxes or any actually that aren't made for metal. They tend to have additives put in, particularly if they promise you things, like if they promise you the world, then be very wary of them. Watch out for things like will illuminate the surface. Probably what that means, it has a ton of stuff in it that shouldn't be in contact with your bronze, things like dichloropropane. You don't want chlorides next to your surface, and once the actual solvent evaporates off, you will find that you have potential activity happening once that coating begins to break down. So what's wrong with beeswax, you might say? I mean, natural is good, isn't it? Well, beeswax has acidic groups in its structure, so when it does break down, it turns into an acidic residue which accelerates the activity that's on the surface of the metal. Now, if it doesn't break down, you're kind of okay, it's stable, but if it's the kind of thing that doesn't get maintained with clockwork frequency, that's when it can be more of a problem. I've got to say, beeswax does smell much nicer than other waxes, other man-made wax. It's also lovely and soft. So, I mean, I can, see the appeal of it. It is appealing. But in terms of the best conservation strategies, it's probably one to put to one side. So, what do we use? We use microcrystalline wax a lot. Renaissance is a pretty good general purpose wax. And as for lacquers, So we like Incralac. It's made for copper alloys and it contains something called a BTA inhibitor, corrosion inhibitor. And that really does help to retard corrosion, and it also stands up very well to ultraviolet light. Critically, it's easier to reverse than other lacquers. You still need solvents, absolutely, but you don't need some of the nastier solvents. And that's what makes it a conservator's friend. It also makes it really helpful for anyone who is going to be looking after your statue going forward. I have put a couple of affiliate links with these products in the show notes, so that if you wanted to try them out, you can. Oh, I know what's just occurred to me. Oils. Why haven't I mentioned oils? Well, the reason I have is because you shouldn't use them. That's the simple answer. Unfortunately, oils are very slow drying, which means that if you apply them to a cold metal surface, which bronze usually is outdoors, unless it's a very hot day, then it's very hot, but it tends to dry very slowly, and in that interim time you're giving a ton of dusty, yucky, sticky stuff to attach itself to the surface, and when it does that, obviously you are introducing contaminants. But I mean, sometimes it stays sticky for so long that really I've turned up and looked at a statue and it is completely hairy. It just looks, or feathery, or I mean, it just looks like someone's rolled the statue in something, and that's because it's taken so long to cure that it's just, acted like sort of Velcro for all rubbish that's in the area. Another thing I've come across, people use goose fat. So you may use goose fat on your roast potatoes, but you may not use it on your statues. It's a terrible idea, or any bronze. For some reason, it got really popular for a while. Someone obviously must have had it on YouTube and been advising it. But no, don't use it. It's a bad idea. My last thoughts on this topic are, do pick a copy of my book up, Bronze Behaving Badly, which takes you through a little bit slower, maybe more precisely, about the pros and cons of protective coatings, different ones, and how you should think about them. And you can buy that from wherever good books are sold. But you also could come onto my course. I have an online Bronze Behaving Badly course, which is mostly for managers and gallery owners, custodians of sculpture, but it has loads and loads of photographs which give you some really good examples of the pros and cons of these things and makes it much more self-explanatory. Also hear me nattering on for ages and ages about things, more nattering. And the other point that comes to mind is that I know that it's a terrible blow to your clients to know that they have to think about laying money out ongoing every year maybe, or every month sometimes, to maintain their sculpture. But all I can say is that to help them to prevent damage is far, far cheaper than curing that damage after it's happened, apart from obviously the loss that happens when something is not looked after properly, and especially in terms of art. But there is just this pain factor that seems to be in place at this idea of having to do something that costs money so frequently, but you really are making their lives easier in the long run. And actually that does make your life easier, because it's easiest to blame someone for something deteriorating, and obviously who do they look to blame? They look to blame the person that they've just bought it off of. It's your fault that this looks like this, when actually it isn't your fault. It's potentially the environment, or the fact that it's just been forgotten about for quite a while, and what's happened is that coating has become redundant. So I hope that's been useful to you, and do send me any questions that you might have occurred to you when I've been blathering on. I'd be really happy to answer them. If I get enough questions, I might do a Q&A kind of podcast session. Otherwise, I will just maybe chat to you about them at the end of one of these other practical episodes. Coming up in the next episode is Mark Richards, a figurative sculptor who has got many, many magnificent projects to his name, including the Vernon Monument in Gunwharf Quays, and the Matthew Flinders sculpture in Euston Station, and the Roger Casement statue in Dunleary, just to name a few. He is a really tremendous sculptor, incredibly innovative and committed to the projects that he carries out for various communities. You'll love his interview. He's got a great story to tell. So join in to be inspired by Mark Richards. If you're looking for a new book, please consider one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, where sculpture is always at the heart of the story. You can get them on the show website, on the usual online retailers, or even better, keep your local library alive, ask for them in there. Thank you for joining me today. Sculpture Vulture has been brought to you by Antique Bronze.